Good morning, boys and girls. Today we're going to read Plains Indians, the first nation of North America. And Plains Indians was written by Andrew Santella. Here we have our table of content. We have who were the first people in North America on page 4. What are the Great Plains on page 8. Who are the Indians of the Great Plains on page 10. What animals did the early Plains Indians need on page 14? What did the early Plains Indians farm on page 20? What were early Plains Indians communities like? Page 22. How were early Plains Indian tribes organized? Page 28. What objects did the early Plains Indians create? Page 32. What did the early Plains Indians believe? Page 34. How did contact with non-Indians affect the Plains Indians? On page 36. What is modern life like for Plains Indians on page 40? We also have a timeline on page 42, a glossary on page 44, and we can find out more on page 46, and there's an index on page 48. And down here it has a little sidebar box that says some words are shown in bold, like this, really thick. You can find out what they mean by looking in the back in the glossary. Who were the first people in North America? It sounded like an earthquake. A herd of bisons charged across the grassy plains, their hoofs rumbling. Hunters rode on horses at the edge of the herd. Skilled riders, they used only their knees to guide their horses. Each hunter was trying to get close enough to one of the bisons to aim a killing blow at the animal's heart. The hunters knew that their families depended on the bisons for food and clothing. These hunters were the early people of the Great Plains of North America. For many of the native people who lived on the Great Plains, hunting bison was a way of life. Today, bison no longer roam freely across the Great Plains, but the Plains Indians proudly keep alive many of their customs and traditions. For this page, there is a caption. Remember, the caption explains the picture. The bison hunt was at the center of the Plains Indians' life. This picture has a caption that says, Carl Venne, 1946 to 2009, was a leader of the Crow Nation of Montana. He worked to create opportunities for his people. American Indian or Native American. Sometimes the native people of North America are referred to as American Indians. Sometimes they're called Native Americans. So which is correct? When Italian explorer Christopher Columbus came to the Americas in 1492, he used the name Indios, or Indians, to describe the native people. This was because he mistakenly believed that he was in the Indies. An old term for Asia, Native American, came into use in the 1960s as an alternative to Indian. Today, many of these descendants of the first people who live in North America would say that either term is acceptable. Better still, most would prefer to be identified by their unique group, called a nation or a tribe. For example, I am a Cheyenne. The first North Americans. People had lived in what now is the United States for more than 12,000 years. Scientists believe that people migrated by walking across a land bridge that once linked North America to Asia. Then, over many years, these people spread out across North and South America. These early people survived by hunting large animals and gathering wild plants. Most of what we know about these early people comes from the objects they left behind. Archaeologists have discovered stone tools and animal bones that suggest people were living on the Great Plains at least 10,000 years ago. This map, here's my caption for this map, This map shows some of the routes that early people took when they spread across to North America. So you can see that Asia used to be connected by a land bridge right here, and they came across and then they went down and came all across the United States all the way to South America. Over here is another map. And remember, map shows us what the land looked like. This map shows the 10 American Indian culture areas in North America. So you have, and you even have you have the Plains Indians, you have the Southeast, the Northeast, the Southwest, the Great Basin, California, the Northwest Coast. So those are the 10 great areas that they lived. And there are culture areas. People who study American Indians divide North America into 10 culture areas. Each culture area has its own distinctive geography, climate, and way of life. Before European explorers arrived, several million American Indians thrived across North America. They spoke many languages and had unique customs, beliefs, and legends. People who lived in the same culture area often had similar lifestyles. What are the Great Plains? The Great Plains area is an immense grassland in the middle of North America. It stretches from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, and from Canada's Saskatchewan River to Texas. It covers parts of 14 United States and 3 Canadian provinces. The region's tall grasses bend in the strong winds that blow across the landscape. There are some wooded areas, especially along rivers and creeks, where willows and cottonwood trees grow. But none of the large forests found in other parts of North America exist in the Great Plains. While much of the region is flat, there are few hilly areas. These include the Ozark Mountains of the Missouri and Arkansas, and the Black Hills of South Dakota. And this is a picture of the Great Plains. It says, tall grasses bend in the strong wind that blows across the Great Plains. And this picture has a caption that says, winter brings extreme cold and snow to the Great Plains. Climate. On the Great Plains, extreme weather is common. Winters can be bitterly cold with frequent snowy blizzards. Summers bring scorching heat on the high winds. On the western Great Plains, only between 10 and 20 inches, 25 to 50 centimeters of rain fall each year. Short, tough grass thrives in this dry climate. Further east, rainfall increases to 20 to 40 inches, 50 to 100 centimeters each year. This extra moisture helps grasses of the prairie near the Mississippi River to grow very tall. Grasses there can grow as high as 12 feet. That's 3.7 meters tall. That is about twice of the average human being. Who are the Indians of the Great Plains? On the dry western Great Plains, early Indians lived mainly by hunting bison. Instead of living in permanent villages, they often moved from place to place. Following bison herds and gathering wild plants, they became expert hunters and came to depend on the bison for most of their needs. The Indian groups of the Great Plains. Some Indian groups or tribes had once been farmers in the woodlands of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa. These people included the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Sioux. Around 1400, they moved to the Great Plains and adopted to the nomadic lifestyle. Plains people roamed wildly, but most tribes could usually be found in a particular area. For example, the Arapaho hunted mainly in Colorado, and the Cheyenne hunted mainly in Wyoming. In this photograph, the early Plains Indians were often on the move. See, they had their little tripods in the back. This is a map, shows some of the traditional tribal homelands. So you can see the Blackfeet were here, The Assiniboine were here, the Crow, the Mandan, the Arikara, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Pawnee, the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Wichita. The Sioux were one of the largest Plains tribes and were made up of several different groups. The Teton Sioux, or Dakota, and the Yankton Sioux, or Nakota, occupied the Black Hills of South Dakota and lands to the west. The Blackfeet people of the Assiniboine people could be found in northern Montana along the present-day border to the U.S. and Canada. The Crow people lived to the south along the Yellowstone River. The area that's now Texas and Oklahoma was home to the Kiowa and the Comanche. Both tribes were famous for their skilled horsemen. In fact, the Comanche were among the first Indian to acquire horses from the herds that Spanish explorers brought to North America in the 1600s. You can see more information on page 17. Farmers, hunters, and of the Great Plains. On the eastern Great Plains, more plentiful rainfall created conditions favorable to farming. Tribes in these areas raised crops such as corn, beans, and squash. Like tribes to the west, they also hunted buffalo, but they did not share their nomadic lifestyle with the Western Plains Indians. Because their farms provided much of what they needed to survive, they were able to live in the village for most of the year. The Wichita people lived along the Arkansas River in the 1500s. They were among the first Plains Indians to meet Europeans. Further north were the Kansa people, who migrated to the present-day Kansas from their original homes east of the Mississippi River. And in this illustration, it says the Mandan people were among the largest of the Plains farming tribes. And this right here shows a photograph of a grass lodge that belonged to the Pawnee. The Pawnee were one of the largest farming tribes. They lived along the Nebraska Platte River. The Mandan built their villages on high bluffs along the Missouri and the North Dakotas. There are many stories and legends of how the Mandan came up to be. Most Indian tribes tell how their people came to be. These stories, called origin tales, are passed down from generation to generation. According to their stories, the Mandan people emerged from the earth just as their crops do. They say that long ago the Mandan lived underground. Some brave Mandan climbed a huge vine and reached the earth above them. Seeing how beautiful the land was, they convinced the rest of their people to join them on the surface. What animals did early Plain Indians need? Plain Indians depended for survival on different kinds of animals and provided many of their daily needs. The bison was the center of life for the early Plains Indians. The bison is the largest land animal to roam North America in modern times. Even though an adult weighs as much as about 1 ton, over 2,000 pounds, bison can still run speeds around 30 miles per hour. For thousands of years, bisons roamed the Great Plains in huge herds. And here's a picture of bisons. Bisons roaming the Great Plains in enormous herds. These enormous animals provided most of what Plains people needed to live. Plains Indians were expert at hunting bison and at making use of every part of the animal. The clothes they wore had a cone-shaped tents they lived in called teepees, were made from bison hides. They sharpened their bones of bisons and carved them into tools. They used their horns of the bisons to make spoons and cups and rattles and toys. They braided shaggy bison hair into rope. Of course, bison were an important source for food, too. After men hunted the animal, see more on page 18 and 19, women cut up the bison meat. They preserved some of it for later by cutting it into long strips and hanging it to dry on racks in the hot sun. Once meat was dried this way, it could be stored for long periods of time without spoiling. The bison was like walking store, providing food, clothing, tools, and more. Even bison waste was put to use. Plains Indians used it to fuel their campfires. And this picture shows Plains woman dries bison meat in the sun to preserve it for later use. This method is still used to dry meat today. We call that beef jerky, well, bison jerky there. In this photograph, you see a picture that before they acquired horses, Plains Indians depended on dogs to help them move heavy loads. And you can see there's a dog that's kind of pulling this little wagon thing. Transportation. Before they acquired horses, the early Indians traveled on foot. They relied on dogs to carry heavy loads as they followed bison herds across the plains. They loaded their supplies and belongings into a kind of sled called a travois. The travois was made up of two poles tied together in a V shape with strips of rawhide stretched across the V. This travois was attached to the shoulders of the dog, which dragged the load behind himself. Oh, so there's two poles and it's tied to the dog. I can see the strip right here where it's tied. Horses. The first modern horses were brought to North America by Spanish explorers in the 1600s. Small early horses had once lived in North America millions of years ago, but they died out about 9000 BC. Plains Indians began to acquire horses through trading with other tribes or by raiding other tribes. By the late 1700s, horses were common among the Plains Indians. Horses changed the way Plains Indians lived. With horses, Plains Indians could travel further and faster than ever before. It made their nomadic lifestyle easier, allowing them to move their camps from place to place as they followed the bison. Plains Indian also found that they could track and hunt bison more effectively on horseback. Tribes such as the Crow gave up their farming lifestyle and became nomadic hunters. Horses also made them more effective warriors, able to attack their enemies quickly and suddenly. In this picture, as the Plains Indians became skilled riders. Hunting. Hunting was one of the most important parts of the Plains Indian culture. Plains Indians hunted many animals, but none are more important than the bison. The nomadic tribes moved from place to place to stay close to the wandering bison. Farming tribes of the prairies left their villages each summer to take part in the annual hunt. Hunting was a community activity for the people of the Great Plains. Men, women, and children worked together to make a successful hunt. The bravest and most skilled hunters and warriors sometimes acted as the hunt police. Their job was to organize the other hunters so that they worked as a team. And in this illustration, you can see Plains hunters carefully made their own weapons. In this photograph, you can see a woman tanned bison hides to make clothes and other objects. Plains Indians developed clever techniques for hunting bisons. Hunters on foot might sneak up on the herd, covering themselves in wolf skins. This way, they could get closer to the animals without alarming them. Another strategy was to start a grass fire that would frighten the bison into stampeding to their death off tall cliffs. After Plains Indian acquired horses, they became skillful riders who would hunt while moving at high speed. When the hunt was over and the bison were killed, there was still so much work to do. Women worked to preserve the meat for future use. They also worked by tanning the bison hide, turning it into leather that they could use for ropes and bedding. What did early Plains Indians farm? Farming was one of the sources of food and wealth for those early Plains Indians that lived in villages. Farming tribes lived on the fertile land along the major rivers and the Great Plains. While plentiful rain and good growing conditions, they grew more corn and extra crops than they needed. Extra crops could be traded with other tribes for metal tools, clothes, bison hides, or other valuable goods. Farming was mainly the work for women. Of They planted the fields, tended them, and harvested their crop. Their tools were made from things found in the natural wood around them. They used animal bones, horns, and antlers to make hoes and rakes. Women also made clay pots for storing the food. This photograph shows tools that the Indians used bones from bisons and other animals to make farming tools. I can see the horn or the antler of a deer, and I can see the bison bone. Three sisters. Corn or maize, as American Indians call it, was the most important crop for most tribes. It grew well in many areas, is easily stored, and could be prepared in a variety of ways. It could be used in soups and stews, or it could be dried and pounded into cornmeal. Women used wooden tools called pressels to grind dried corn into meal. Farming tribes almost always planted corn alongside with squash and beans. Corn stalks provided a pole for the vines to climb. The leaves of the squash planted helped keep the soil moist because the three crops worked so well together. They were often called the three sisters of farming. Tribes also grew pumpkins, sunflower, and tobacco. This is a photograph, of course, of corn was the basic crop of Plains Indians farming tribes. And I'm going to stop here. This was a lot that we read today. See you next time.